Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Greek Way by Edith Hamilton. This book was published in 1930, originally. Been through many printings. I think I have the 16th printing from 1963. This was a very popular book in its day. This was her first book, and it was a huge success. This book made her name. She wrote a couple of books. This is the only one of them that I've read, but hopefully I'll get to some of the others. It's easy to see why this was so popular. She does a fantastic job of bringing the Greeks to life and making them seem like just a remarkable people, which they were, a remarkable people. There's a lot in here that's great. I considered breaking this into a couple episodes. I'm not going to do that, but I was tempted to. Her section on Herodotus is fantastic, and her section on Xenophon is also fantastic. And the way these two writers embodied the Greek way, the Greek spirit, the Greek way of approaching life. Those are both very good sections. I decided not to cover them. Get your hands on this book if you're interested in ancient Greece. You can do a lot worse than this book. This actually should definitely be on your shelf if you're a fan of ancient Greece. There's one other thinker, well, there's a couple other thinkers, but one other thinker here that I really do want to talk about, and that's Pindar. And I also want to talk a little bit about just her overview of ancient Greece. Largely, it's so well written. And I think it says so much that's important about why we should be interested in the Greeks. You know, it was so long ago. And not just be interested in them in a sort of antiquarian, studious manner, but I think we should try to reinvigorate some of these Greek ideals in our own lives and in the modern world. I think the modern world needs people who embody this ideal. You know, our Western world is in a fallen state. In many ways, we haven't mustered the necessary virtues that we need to seize control of our own situation as it's whittled away and we lose control and we become overrun with foreign people. And I think there's a sort of vitality, a thumos in our hearts that has to be kindled in order for us to be as aggressive and as virtuous and as forthright as we need to be. And the Greeks are a great model for how we should be. Now, of course, she does a little bit, I think, find what she likes in the Greeks and dismisses what she may not be as interested in or not like as much. Most authors do this. I think that she does find a little bit of modern liberalism in the ancient Greeks. Not a tremendous amount, but a little bit. We're talking more of sort of a classical liberalism. You know, like I said, this is almost 100 years old. It's not quite the liberalism we contend with today. It's more of like that turn of the century Americanism, Western values type of thing that we hear about, the individualism and the dedication to science and the sort of things that Western liberals of 100 years ago felt themselves to be the champions of. So she finds a little bit of that. She's also has written about Christianity. She's a religious woman, and that comes through here a little bit. I'll talk about that at a later point. But she, like a great many students of Greece, puts everything in a sort of Christian or monotheistic spin, you know. Sort of discounts the fact that these guys weren't Christians and they weren't monotheists. They were polytheistic pagans, and that gets discounted or even ignored a little bit. And unfortunately, that's just really common in these writers. So when we look at people that are talking about the ancient Greeks in that time period of 100 years ago or 200 years ago, in that era, the 19th and early 20th century, it's just so common to see, and even up till now, it still happens because the writers about Greece now grew up on a diet of these guys. So the same principles that you see in the studies of Greeks from 100 years ago still come through today. So I'm going to read some sections like I always do, some of my favorite parts of the book, jumping in here at the very beginning when she talks about the greatness of Greece. She says, quote, 500 years before Christ, in a little town on the far western border of the settled and civilized world, a strange new power was at work. Something had awakened in the minds and spirits of the men there, which was so to influence the world that the slow passage of long time, of century upon century, and the shattering changes they brought would be powerless to wear away that deep impress. Athens had entered upon her brief and magnificent flowering of genius, which so molded the world of mind and of spirit that our mind and spirit today are different. We think and feel differently because of what a little Greek town did during a century or two, 2,400 years ago. What was then produced of art and of thought has never been surpassed, and very rarely equaled, and the stamp of it is upon all the art and all the thought of the Western world. And yet this full stature of greatness came to pass at a time when the mighty civilizations of the ancient world had perished, and the shadow of effortless barbarism was dark upon the earth. In that black and fierce world, a little center of white-hot spiritual energy was at work. A new civilization had arisen in Athens, unlike all that had gone before. What brought this new development to pass, how the Greeks were able to achieve all they did, has significance for us today. It is not merely that Greece has a claim upon our attention because we are, by our spiritual and mental inheritance, partly Greek, and cannot escape, if we would, that deep influence which worked with power through the centuries, touching with light of reason and grace of beauty the wild northern savages. She has a direct contribution for us as well. The actual Greek remains are so few and so far away, so separated from us by time and a strange, difficult language, they are felt to be matters for the travelers and the scholars, and no more. But in truth, what the Greeks discovered, or rather, how they made their discoveries and how they brought a new world to birth out of the dark confusions of an old world that had crumbled away, is full of meaning for us today, who have seen an old world swept away in the space of a decade or two. It is worth our while, in the confusions and bewilderments of the present, to consider the way by which the Greeks arrived at the clarity of their thought and the affirmation of their art. Very different conditions of life confronted them from those we face, but it is ever to be borne in mind that though the outside of human life changes much, the inside changes little, and the lesson book we cannot graduate from is human experience. Great literature, past or present, is the expression of great knowledge of the human heart. Great art is the expression of a solution of the conflict between the demands of the world without and that within. And in the wisdom of either, there would seem to be small progress. Of all that the Greeks did, only a very small part has come down to us, and we have no means of knowing if we have their best. It would be strange if we had. In the convulsions of that world of long ago, there was no law that guaranteed to art the survival of the fittest. But this little remnant preserved by the haphazard of chance shows the high watermark reached in every region of thought and beauty the Greeks entered. No sculpture comparable to theirs, no buildings ever more beautiful, no writings superior. Prose, always late of development, they had time only to touch on, but they left masterpieces. History has yet to find a greater exponent than Thucydides. Outside of the Bible, there is no poetical prose that can touch Plato. In poetry, they are all but supreme. No epic is to be mentioned with Homer. No odes to be set beside Pindar. Of the four masters of the tragic stage, 3 are Greek. Little is left of all this wealth of great art. The sculptures, defaced and broken into bits, have crumbled away. The buildings are fallen, the paintings gone forever. Of the writings, all lost but a very few. We have only the ruin of what was. The world has had no more than that for well on to 2,000 years. Yet these few remains of the mighty structure have been a challenge and an incitement to men ever since, and they are among our possessions today, which we value as most precious. There is no danger now that the world will not give Greek genius full recognition. Greek achievement is a fact universally acknowledged." End quote. So I love that section. I love the way she opens up this book. That's the very beginning of chapter 1. And she really glorifies ancient Greece. No sculpture has come close to it. No poetry has come close. And all we have are these fragments, these bits and pieces of it. And yet what we have marks the high watermark that every civilization to follow has strived to meet. That's big praise, and I think it's well earned. If you read Homer, it's so moving and it's so powerful. And even though I don't agree with much of Plato's writings, it's true that the history of philosophy has been a history of footnotes to Plato. Plato's influence is so great. Aristotle's influence is so great. And the Greek playwrights, their influence is so great. I'm not sure that of the 4 greatest playwrights, 3 of them were from ancient Greece. The 4th she's implying is Shakespeare. I don't know if that might be a little over the top, perhaps, but the fact remains that the legacy that Greece has left us has shaped everything in our world. Our entire Western world was shaped by ideas generated by the ancient Greeks. And the world that they lived in, 5 centuries, even if you're talking about Homer, as many as perhaps 9 centuries before the birth of Christ, you're talking about a very long time ago, and a barbaric world and a brutal world. And that these guys were able to achieve everything that they achieved is so phenomenal. And it's not just Athens, right? I mean, Homer, I don't think we know much about Homer, but I think it's fair to say that we can't with any certainty say that he was an Athenian. And he definitely wasn't an Athenian in the era of, the classical Athens, the era of Pericles, Socrates, that Plato, that 5th and 4th century BC era. So I think it's fair to say that all of Greece was blossoming, and Athens was probably the greatest of the Greek states. So I find that section moving, and it's like, most of us really never achieve greatness. We might be blind to the greatness of our own society. In many ways, our society stands on the shoulders of giants, right? All of the other societies and civilizations that have come before have laid the foundation for what we have done. And are there innovations in our own society? Yes. But are some of the innovations of our present society maybe not as great, maybe not as powerful or moving us even in the right direction? It's questionable. So I think people don't really have a sense of greatness in their lives. And when they look around them, they don't see things that are great. Can you imagine being in ancient Greece at that time? I think that there's a greatness, there's a power there that wasn't present in the other societies around them, wasn't really present in the same way in their own past. There was so much that was being born anew. There was so much that was being created, so many new areas of study. The birth of philosophy, the birth of science, taking art in a totally new and more advanced direction with the sculpture and the buildings, the architecture, just everything about it. It was just miles beyond the other peoples of the area and of the world and the things that had come before. At least to the best of our knowledge. Something amazing happened in Athens in that time period. And I can only imagine how wonderful it must have been to be there, but even to see greatness, to think about the greatness, to really let it sink into your soul, what it means to be in the presence of greatness when we're in the presence of whatever artifacts and leftover material that we have been able to salvage from that period. It is like touching greatness, and I think it's moving and powerful. So anyhow, let me move to the next section. She talks about how the ancient Greeks believed in an affirmation of the vitality of life. And this is, I think, important for us to understand the Greeks and understand maybe what we need more of ourselves. She says, quote, "To rejoice in life, to find the world beautiful and delightful to live in, was a mark of the Greek spirit which distinguished it from all that had gone before. It is a vital distinction. The joy of life is written upon everything the Greeks left behind, and they who leave it out of account fail to reckon with something that is of first importance in understanding how the Greek achievement came to pass in the world of antiquity. It is not a fact that jumps to the eye for the reason that their literature is marked as strongly by sorrow. The Greeks knew to the full how bitter life is as well as how sweet. Joy and sorrow, exultation and tragedy, stand hand in hand in Greek literature, but there is no contradiction involved thereby. Those who do not know the one do not really know the other either. It is the depressed, the gray-minded people who cannot rejoice just as they cannot agonize. The Greeks were not the victims of depression. Greek literature is not done in gray or with a low palette. It is all black and shining white or black and scarlet and gold. The Greeks were keenly aware, terribly aware, of life's uncertainty and the imminence of death. Over and over again they emphasized the brevity and the failure of all human endeavor, the swift passing of all that is beautiful and joyful. To Pindar, even as he glorifies the victor in the games, life is a shadow's dream, but never, not in their darkest moments, do they lose their taste for life. It is always a wonder and a delight, the world a place of beauty, and they themselves rejoicing to be alive in it. Quotations to illustrate this attitude are so numerous it is hard to make a choice. One might quote all the Greek poems there are, even when they are tragedies. Every one of them shows the fire of life burning high. Never a Greek poet that did not warm both hands at that flame. Often, in the midst of a tragedy, a choral song of joy breaks forth. So Sophocles, of the three tragedians the soberest, the most severe, sings in the Antigone of the wine god, with whom the stars rejoice as they move, the stars whose breath is fire. Or in the Ajax, where thrilling with rapture, soaring on wings of sudden joy, he calls to Pan, O Pan, come, sea rover, down from the snow-beaten mountain crag, Lord of the dance, the gods delight in, come, for now I too would dance, O joy! Or in the Oedipus Coloneus, where tragedy is suddenly put aside by the poet's love of the out-of-door world, of the nightingale's clear, thrilling note, and the stainless tide of pure waters, and the glory of the narcissus and the bright shining crocus, which the choir of the muses love, and Aphrodite of the golden rain. Passages like these come again and again, lifting the black curtain of tragedy to the full joy of life. They are no artifice or trick to heighten by contrast. They are the natural expression of men who were tragedians indeed, but Greeks first, and so thrillingly aware of the wonder and beauty of life, they could not but give it place. The little pleasures, too, that daily living holds were felt as such keen enjoyment. Dear to us ever, says Homer, is the banquet, and the harp, and the dance, and changes of raiment, and the warm bath, and love, and sleep. Eating and drinking have never again seemed so delightful as in the early Greek lyrics, nor a meeting with friends, nor a warm fire of a winter's night. The stormy season of winter, a soft couch against dinner by the fire, honey-sweet wine in your glass, and nuts and beans at your elbow. Nor a run in the springtime, amid a fragrance of woodbine and leisure and white poplar, when the plane tree and the elm whisper together. Nor a banqueting hour, moving among feasting and giving up the soul to be young, carrying a bright harp and touching it in peace among the wise of the citizens. It is a matter of course that comedy should be their invention, the mad, rollicking, irresponsible fun of the old comedy, its verve and vitality and exuberant, overflowing energy of life. A tomb in Egypt and a theater in Greece. The one comes to the mind as naturally as the other. So was the world changing by the time the 5th century before Christ began in Athens. The exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope is an old Greek definition of happiness. It is a conception permeated with energy of life. Through all Greek history, that spirit of life abounding moves. It led along many an untried way. Authoritarianism and submissiveness were not the direction it pointed to. A high-spirited people, full of physical vigor, do not obey easily. And indeed, the strong air of the mountains has never been wholesome for despots. The absolute monarch, submissive slave theory of life flourishes best where there are no hills to give a rebel refuge, and no mountain heights to summon a man to live dangerously. When history begins in Greece, there is no trace of the ancient state. The awful, unapproachable, sacred pontate, pharaoh of Egypt, priest-king of Mesopotamia, whose absolute power none had questioned for thousands of years, is nowhere in the scene. There is nothing that remotely resembles him in Greece. Something we know of the age of tyrants in Greek history, but what we know most clearly is that it was put a stop to. Abject submission to the power on the throne, which had been the rule of life in the ancient world since kings began, and was to be the rule of life in Asia for centuries to come, was cast off by the Greeks so easily, so lightly. Hardly more than an echo of the contest has come down to us. End quote. So again, real moving description of the Greek state of mind and the Greek affirmation of life. And I find it really powerful the way she talks about even in the tragedies. And the one line that I love where she says, "Often in the midst of a tragedy, a choral song of joy breaks forth." I feel like that's almost a sort of spiritual, like, brightening in the light in the midst of the darkest night. Like we saw a little bit of when William James talked about the varieties of religious experience and the healthy mind and the sick mind. And then there was the twice born, which was the sick-minded, but that found in the darkest moments, something broke through of the brightest of lights. And then the person who had experienced such things would become religious or would have a complete change of mindset and adopt generally a religious mindset at that point. But it's fascinating, and I just find it moving, the concept that in the darkest of their tragedies, a choral song of joy breaks forth to find almost a joy in the tragedy itself, that it's not even resignation, but recognition that the true spirit is unbreakable. The true spirit of man is unbreakable, and we'll always be able to rise up like a phoenix from our own ashes. We'll always be able to find the beauty in sorrow and the beauty in darkness, or something like that. I like it. It represents a person. It comes from a person who understands the full breadth of life, who has seen the brightest of days and the darkest of days, and knows the depth of life, and doesn't fall into that sort of gray monotony. She says the Greeks weren't gray, depressed people who couldn't rise up to heights nor sink to darkness, but just lived in a sort of strange mediocrity, which is where many of us are now, in a sort of state of grayness. We don't rend our hair, we don't feel the depths of sorrow, and we also don't ascend to the heights of joy. That vitality and love of life is just sorely needed among us. So, moving on, she talks a little bit about how science and reason and logic were largely born in Greece, or had their, let's say, their fullest manifestation as of yet among the Greeks. She says, quote, "Love of reason and of life, delight in the use of the mind and body, distinguished the Greek way. The Egyptian way and the way of the East had led through suffering and by the abnegation of the intellect to the supremacy of the spirit. That goal the Greeks could never come within sight of. Their own nature and the conditions of their life alike shut them off from it. But they knew the way of the spirit no less. The all-sufficing proof that the world of the spirit was where the flame of their genius burned highest is their art. Indeed, their intellectuality has been obscured to us precisely by virtue of that transcendent achievement. Greece means Greek art to us, and that is a field in which the reason does not rule. The extraordinary flowering of the human spirit which resulted in Greek art shows the spiritual power there was in Greece. What marked the Greeks off from Egypt and India was not an inferior degree of spirituality, but a superior degree of mentality. Great mind and great spirit were combined in them. The spiritual world was not to them another world from the natural world. It was the same world as that known to the mind. Beauty and rationality were both manifested in it. They did not see the conclusions reached by the spirit and those reached by the mind as opposed to each other. Reason and feeling were not antagonistic. The truth of poetry and the truth of science were both true. It is difficult to illustrate this conception of reality by isolated quotations, but the attitude of the greatest of Greek scientists may serve as an example. Aristotle was, in one sense, the typical scientist, a man endowed with extraordinary powers of observation and of reasoning upon his data, preoccupied with what he could see and what he could know. Anywhere else and at any other time, he would have been the man of pure reason, viewing with condescension, if not contempt, conclusions reached in any way except that of the mind. But to Aristotle the Greek, the way of the spirit was also important, and the scientific method sometimes to be abandoned in favor of the poetic method. In his well-known statement in the Poetics that poetry has a higher truth than history, since it expresses truth of general application, whereas that of history is partial and limited, he is not speaking as a scientist. Nor would the statement commend itself to the scientific mind outside of Greece. There is no evidence, again, of the scientist's point of view in the great passage where he sets forth the reason for the works of his life, his search into the nature of all living things. The glory, doubtless, of the heavenly bodies fills us with more delight than the contemplation of these lowly things. But the heavens are high and far off, and the knowledge of celestial things that our senses give us is scanty and dim. Living creatures, on the contrary, are at our door, and if we so desire, we may gain full and certain knowledge of each and all. We take pleasure in a statue's beauty. Should not then the living fill us with delight? And all the more, if in the spirit of the love of knowledge we search for causes, and bring to light evidences of meaning. Then will nature's purpose and her deep-seated laws be revealed in all things, all tending in her multitudinous work to one form or another of the beautiful. Did ever scientist outside of Greece so state the object of scientific research? To Aristotle, being a Greek, it was apparent that the full purpose of that high enterprise could not be expressed in any way except the way of poetry, and being a Greek, he was able to express it. Spirituality inevitably brings to our mind religion. Greek religion is known to us chiefly or only as a collection of fairy tales, by no means always edifying. This is to belie the immense hold the Greeks had on things spiritual. It would have been impossible for the nation that produced the art and the poetry of Greece to have a permanently superficial view of religion, just as it would have been impossible for them not to use their minds on Homer's gods and goddesses. Those charming stories, which came down from a time when men had a first-hand knowledge of nature now forever lost, were never, it is true, anathematized with book and bell and public recantation. That was not the Greek way. They loved them, and their fancy played with them, but they found their way through them to what underlies all religion, East or West. End quote. Okay, so we have a couple things here that are interesting. She says largely that the ancient world, much of the ancient world, ancient Egypt and the way of the East, had sort of denigrated the intellect and elevated the spirit, that the spirit is of a higher realm than the mind, and that things can only be known by a sort of sort of spiritual intuition, that things could be known as true not when the thinking mind arrives at them, but when they spring forth from the spirit or the soul, which is something deeper and more permanent than the chattering mind. There's a separation in the Eastern world, and that the real truth of spiritual matters don't come from the mind. And she says the Greek never really adopted that. They couldn't be that way. Their minds were too active, and their love of life was too strong to simply say that something like their intellect was a meaningless or even useless endeavor. But they still knew the spirit. But one thing that's interesting, she says that the intellectuality of the Greeks has been obscured to us by the virtue of that transcendent achievement, meaning that their genius burned brightest in their art. That power of the art is strong enough that it obscures their intellectuality. She says Greece means Greek art to us, and that is a field in which the reason does not rule. I don't know if that's the case nowadays. I think many people, we get this a lot from conservatives, Christian conservatives in particular, that I saw it stated on X recently in a very simple way that from Jesus we get objective morality, and from Plato we get objective reason. That's a pretty straightforward, simple way of looking at it, and I think that it misses a lot. And whether it's Plato or Aristotle, too many people look at the sort of culmination, if you will, of Greek philosophy, whom we ascribe to Plato and Aristotle, perhaps only because those are the writers whose books we have, but that's neither here nor there. But let's say those are the greatest of the Greek thinkers, and those are the guys whose books we have. And that's like what Greece is. That's what we got from Greece, is this dedication to reason and logic. And then our morality, our spirituality, everything that is part of another aspect of life comes from Jerusalem, comes from the Bible, like Ben Shapiro had talked about the bridge between Athens and Jerusalem. And Western civilization is this combination / tension between reason and religion. And it's the religion of Jerusalem and the reason of Athens. And you can go back and listen to The Right Side of History by Shapiro, where he talked about that. But there's a lot more to Greece than just like the syllogism, than just Aristotelian logic, or even Platonic thinking about ideas, or the Socratic method, or the birth of philosophy. There's more there than just that. And when I read that, I thought, well, people must have had a very different view of the Greeks when Edith Hamilton was writing than they do today, because nowadays everybody says, well, maybe it's just everybody on the right. I don't know. Maybe the conservatives say, seems to be the most common belief that the value of the Greeks was in their philosophy, reason, logic. Man is a rational animal, right? The rationality of the Greeks is their greatest contribution, and everything else is sort of not as important. And she says that actually, like, the art of Greece is very important, is how we understand Greece is through their art, and their intellectuality is obscured by that. So that's an interesting take. She talks a little bit about Aristotle when he gives an explanation of why he conducts science, why he makes the explorations into the world that he makes. I think this is an important thing that I've talked about, similar to the sentiment of rationality by William James, that why do we engage in science? What is the underpinning foundation of science? Not just from a logical sense, what is a proof? How do we know that the basic logic of the most fundamental logical statement, or the law of non-contradiction, and the basic syllogism, the basic ideas of logical theory, like how do we know that those basics are true, right? It comes down to a sort of intuition at bottom. You can't justify upon justification upon a justification. Something somewhere has to be self-evidently true and require no justification. And the self-evidence of it is derived from a sensation that you have, a feeling that you have when you hear it and you think, of course, that is correct. You know, something can't be both, A can't be equal to B and not equal to B at the same time, right? You can't have a contradictory statement. And that's just the basic intuition of the laws of reality. But there's more here than that, and it's a question of why. Why do we want to know? Why do we want to engage in science? Now, is Aristotle correct? I'm not sure that he's completely correct. I think evolution has a role to play here, as I've spoken about in other episodes, but also he just talks about a sense of wonder. He says, we all take pleasure in a statue's beauty. Should not then the living fill us with delight? And all the more, if in the spirit of the love of knowledge, we search for causes and bring to light evidences of meaning. If we can find meaning and causes and beauty and delight and wonder in our knowledge of things, then that is why we do it. She says he offers a poetic explanation. She says, to Aristotle, it was apparent that the full purpose of the high enterprise of science could not be expressed in any way except the way of poetry. That's interesting. That's interesting. And then she touches on to religion here. And I have to say that I'm not going to go into great depth in some of the sections on religion. But she doesn't talk tremendously about religion. She's got a section at the end about religion. And it frustrates me because she seems to discount the ancient Greek mythology as like not really religion or not a worthy religion, not a religion worthy of the Greeks. And what she does throughout this book, and maybe that's partly explained by the section on religion, but I really think honestly that it isn't explained. Because what she does is the same thing that so many other people do, which is where she kind of says, well, you know, the Greeks hung on to their old religion. They didn't exactly renounce it. She says it wasn't anathematized with book and bell and public recantation. That wasn't the Greek way. They loved their myths, and their fancy played with them, but they found their way through them, meaning the stories. She says the charming stories, which came down from a time when men had a first-hand knowledge of nature. Those stories, they saw through those stories and saw their way to what underlies all religion, east or west. Well, this is a sort of presumption that there is some world of the spirit, some spiritual truth that underlies all religion, and that the Greek myths themselves aren't actually expressing any truths in that way, but they found their way through those myths to something deeper. And maybe there's a sense in which that's true, but it discounts the Greeks. And the point I'm making is that through this book, when she talks about the philosophers, when she talks about the tragedians, when she talks about the poets, constantly she translates that. A lot of the translations here she does herself. And when she translates them, they're always talking about God. God this, God that, our relationship with God. And we know that like the Greeks were pagan, polytheistic people. And they didn't talk about God like that. They would talk about the God. But they meant that in the same way that I might say we have split the atom. I don't mean there's one atom. I mean the atom as a category of thing. Right? And that's how they spoke about it. They would say the God this, the God that. Like one might say the greatest invention of mankind is the computer. Doesn't mean that computer, that one computer, right? It means the computer as a category of thing. And that's how the Greeks spoke about the gods. But because they use that sort of singular term, it's always mistranslated as God with a capital G, as if they're talking about Yahweh, the God of the Jews, which is how we understand when we say God with a capital G, that is what we mean, the God of the Bible. Then nobody believes that they're talking about something different when you say that. And so it's a mistranslation, in my opinion. And it's a mistranslation that's given a sort of hand waving. And she's not the only person that does this. Many, many, many people translate this way and speak about the Greeks this way, as if the traditional Greek religion was for the bumpkins, but all of the great Greek thinkers had figured out that there's one true God. And so they couched their terminology in the myths of the time because that was kind of palatable to the people. I don't think that's true. I think that's a way that people mischaracterize ancient Greece in order to quell their feelings that they're taking all this life advice from ancient pagans who worshipped false gods. So they have to kind of reframe it in a way that makes it palatable. That's just my opinion, but I find it irritating. I wish they would translate it more honestly. But with that said, I'm going to move forward to Pindar. I'm a fan of Pindar, although his poetry is notoriously difficult. He makes a lot of references to things that we don't understand. He talks about circumstances that were going on at the time in kind of veiled terms, and it's we don't know enough about it even if he was clear. But when he's speaking vaguely, then we know even less about it. So it's hard to translate and it's hard to understand some of Pindar. I've tackled a little bit of Pindar, but I like his vibe. I like his vibe. And I like what she has to say about Pindar here, where she says, quote, "Pindar is the last spokesman for the Greek aristocracy and the greatest after Homer. The aristocratic ideal, so powerful in shaping the Greek genius, is shown best of all in his poetry. He was an aristocrat by race and by conviction, born in the late 6th century when aristocracy in Greece was nearing its end. The first democracy in the world was coming to birth in Athens. Pindar was the figure upon which much romantic pity and sympathy have been expended, the champion of a dying cause. The man who fights for a new cause does not receive that tribute. He is up against the immense force of stubborn resistance the new always arouses. He must give battle without trumpets and drums, and with the probability that he will not live to see the victory. Indeed, he cannot be sure that there will ever be a victory. Nevertheless, he is far more to be envied than the man who tries to turn the tide back, and that is what Pindar did. To judge him fairly, one must consider what the ideal was that produced the aristocratic creed. It was founded upon a conception altogether different from the one behind tyranny, of all power in the hands of a single man. The tyrants departed from Greece unlamented, and never to be revived again, even in wishful thinking, except for Plato's rulers, who were to be given absolute power only upon the condition that they did not want it, a curious parallel to the attitude prescribed by the early church. A man appointed to the episcopacy was required to say, perhaps still must say, forms live so long after the spirit once in them is dead, "I do not want to be a bishop. Nolo episcopari." To the fathers of the church, as to Plato, no one who desired power was fit to wield it. But the case for the aristocracy was different. In the aristocratic creed, power was to be held by men who alone were immune to the temptations that beset, on the one hand, those struggling to be powerful, and on the other, those struggling to survive. The proper leaders of the world, the only ones who could be trusted to guide it disinterestedly, were a class from generation to generation raised above the common level, not by self-seeking ambition, but by birth. A class which great tradition and a careful training made superior to the selfish greed and servile meanness which other men were subject to. As a class, they were men of property, but position was not dependent upon wealth. The blood ran as blue in the veins of the poor noble as in the rich, and precedence was never a mere matter of money. Thus, absolutely sure and secure, free from the anxious personal preoccupations which distract men at large, They could see clearly on the lofty eminence they were born to, what those lower down could not catch a glimpse of, and they could direct mankind along the way it should go. Nor was their own way, the aristocratic way, by any means a path to ease. They had standards not accessible to ordinary men, standards well nigh impossible to men obliged to fight for their daily bread. An aristocrat must not tell a lie except in love and war. He must keep his word, never take advantage of another, be cheated in a bargain rather than cheat by so much as a hair's breadth. He must show perfect courage, perfect courtesy, even to an enemy, a certain magnificence in the conduct of his life, a generous liberality as far as his means could be stretched, and he must take pride in living up to this severe code. Aristocrats subjected themselves as proudly and willingly to the exacting discipline of the gentleman as they did to the rigid discipline of the warrior. High privilege was theirs, but it was weighted by great responsibility. The burden of leadership lay upon them. They must direct and protect the unprivileged. Nobility of birth must be matched by nobility of conduct. This was the creed of the aristocracy. Theoretically, it is impeccable. Men placed by birth in a position where disinterestedness was easy were trained from childhood to rule other men for their greater welfare. Purely as a theory, there is not another that can compete with it, except the one that all men are to be enabled to be disinterested, trained to be rulers, not of others, but each of his own self, and all interdependent, equally bound to give help and to accept it. This utopia, the merest dream so far, is the only conception that surpasses or even matches the conception of authority in the hands of the disciplined best. But most unfortunately for the world, it did not work. There was no fault with the idea, only with its supporters. It was never allowed to work by those who upheld it. That is beyond dispute to us today. From the first moment that we catch sight of it in history, it is a failure. Class privilege has become class prejudice, if it had ever been anything else. Inherited power creates a thirst for acquiring more power. Nobility of birth has no connection with spiritual nobility. The aristocrats always failed every time they had their chance. Their latest embodiment, the English House of Lords, endowed by birth with all the best the world could give, power, riches, reverential respect, fought throughout the 19th century with almost religious resolution every attempt to raise the condition, the wages, or education of the agricultural laborer. We all know that by now, but Pindar did not. He believed that the great had and would use their power for the benefit of others. His poems expressed to perfection, and for the last time in Greek literature, the class consciousness of the old Greek aristocracy, their conviction of their own lofty moral and religious value. It has often been pointed out that the perfect expression of anything means that the thing has reached its culmination and is on the point of declining. Is not perfect clarity the sign of the weariness of ideas? The statue of the young man throwing the discus, the charioteer at Delphi, the stern young horseman of the Parthenon frieze, and the poetry of Pindar, all show the culmination of the great ideal Greek aristocracy inspired just before it came to an end. Physical perfection which evokes mysteriously the sense of spiritual perfection. Every poem Pindar wrote is a tribute to that ideal. End quote. So a couple things in here. She praises Pindar, but she also has some interesting and odd things to say about aristocracy. She says it's different from tyranny. Tyrants were not respected in Greece. The tyrants departed from Greece unlamented. Nobody really wished for their return except for Plato, and Plato's ideal of a tyrant was the philosopher king, and a very particular type. And interestingly, that Plato said that the men who rule should not be the men who want to rule. She says to the fathers of the church as to Plato, no one who desired power was fit to wield it. But aristocracy is a different scenario. People don't acquire power in aristocracy. A tyrant can come to power, right? No child is born a tyrant. Tyranny is generally the domain of people who crave power. They want to be tyrants. They want to be leaders. They want control. The aristocracy doesn't ever have to strive for power. in theory, because they're born with power. They just have it, and then they can spend their lives learning how to use it. And what is odd and interesting is she says that in theory, this all makes a lot of sense. The theory is not flawed. It's that the people are flawed who try to implement it, because the aristocrats are always chasing after more power. They don't feel a sense of noblesse oblige. They don't feel responsibility for their subjects or for the other people among them or in their city-state or in their nation who are not aristocrats. They don't feel that they have a duty to the working people. And what she says that I think is most interesting and strange, she says, purely as a theory, there's not another that can compete with it, except the one that all men are to be enabled to be disinterested, trained to be rulers, not of others, but each of his own self, and all interdependent, equally bound to give help and to accept it. That's a sort of strange form of liberal communism, where each person is trained not to be rulers of others, but of him or herself. People are trained not to take control, but only to control themselves and to give of themselves to others. That all people are interdependent and equally bound to give help and to accept it. And people are trained from birth to be that way. So it's a bit of a sort of hive mind in a way. Each person's responsible for himself, but also responsible to others, but never demanding to rule over others. A kind of utopian communism. She says that's the only ideal superior to aristocracy, but she says this utopia, the merest dream so far, is the only conception that surpasses or even matches the conception of authority in the hands of the disciplined best. So this is a sort of potentially superior to aristocracy, but has never been done. She calls it a utopia, the merest dream so far, and I think will always remain the merest dream, because at that point you're just severing all bonds with reality. I mean, if aristocracy doesn't work because people are selfish, why would this pure, selfless communism of autonomous units have any bearing on reality? I mean, it would be better if we could sprout wings and fly than to have to walk around. But what's the point? Because we're not going to sprout wings and fly. It's assuming people are nothing like what they really are. So why bother? But she says that aristocracy always fails. From the first moment we catch sight of it in history, it's a failure. Power creates a thirst for acquiring more power. Now, perhaps this is just the way of mankind. Any people who have power are going to want to acquire more power. Maybe aristocracy doesn't work for that reason. There's no check on it. There's no power in the hands of the non-aristocrats to restrain the aristocrats. Maybe aristocracy doesn't take account of. But, if one has to wonder, right, if the ancient Eastern world that she describes of the king and the slaves that we just saw in previous sections that had ruled over Egypt and the Eastern lands and everywhere but Athens up to that point, this sort of God Emperor King and all of the subjects, the one man in charge of everything and the plethora of subjects, if that doesn't work, if it doesn't allow for flourishing among the people, if it doesn't allow for a place like Athens to arise, and yet Athens arose, right? And it didn't arise out of tyranny. The Athens that she speaks of as being so glorious and so beautiful and amazing arose out of aristocracy, right? Athens wasn't always a democracy. If Pindar is the last defender of the old order, then the old order is aristocracy, not not the God Emperor King tyranny. So what we see in that case is a sort of transition from not from the God Emperor King and the nation of slaves directly into Athenian democracy, but we see it move through a transition period. We see the first transition from the tyranny to the aristocracy. Then, under the conditions of aristocracy, we see Athens and Greece rise to the position of greatness that she speaks of. Then we see that it transitions again from the aristocracy, which was the condition under which the greatness of Greece arose. Then it transitions into democracy. And there were certainly great things that occurred in the Athenian democracy. But we also see that Athens got defeated pretty soundly by Sparta when it was a democracy. And we see that Rome ultimately conquered Greece and conquered much of the Mediterranean world, well, all of the Mediterranean world, and Rome was much more of an aristocracy. So when Greece deviated from the aristocratic ideal, which was so flawed, according to Hamilton, which was always from its very first inception, was unjust. As soon as that aristocracy is overturned, what do we see? We see the beginning of the decline of Greece. Now it rides out its greatness for a while, and it continues to create great new things. But the pinnacle of Greece was the point at which it stopped being an aristocracy and began a slow decline into irrelevance. Alexander the Great did not come from democratic Athens. He came from Macedonia, and he was a king. Athens, it did have its Athenian empire, but this Athenian empire was not massive. It ruled Greece. And upon its first real challenge from Sparta, it was defeated. Because the democracy in Athens, as we saw when we looked at Thucydides, made some remarkably bad choices. Maybe if Athens had still been an aristocracy, perhaps a sort of mixed system that I've spoken about before and that Aristotle seems to support and some others have supported throughout history, which we even have today in a way in America, which maybe has allowed America to be so successful. Components of aristocracy, maintaining the good parts of aristocracy, but putting some sort of check on the aristocracy by giving the commoners some degree of political power. I don't know, but I'm skeptical that aristocracy itself is just so damaging as she describes, and I'm skeptical that this so-called superior system that she envisions isn't a sort of form of communism that has never been, she says it's only ever been a dream. Her vision of the potentially superior, this utopia, the merest dream so far, is the only conception that surpasses or even matches the conception of authority in the hands of the disciplined best. So her potential vision has never happened. So you should be skeptical that your idea is better than the things that have happened in the world when your idea has never been successfully done. That's all I'll say about that. So I think I'll wrap it up with there. There are a few other interesting sections. Like I said, the section on religion is kind of interesting, although I think I disagree with her approach. It's dismissive, I think. But with that said, this is a book that I highly recommend. And I thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.